Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. I was so happy to be invited here and to come to Bulgaria for the first time for this occasion with this beautiful exhibition that will open soon. It's really a treat. And to have this opportunity tonight to talk about the sword, the craft of the sword, the symbolism of the sword, to a group of people who have an active interest in the topic is really fantastic. So thank you for coming here tonight. I call this lecture Reflections on the Sword, because we will look on the sword from many different angles tonight. And it will be a journey that will be fairly quick. I will go through many topics and I will touch on them fairly lightly. After the talk, there will be ample time for questions for those of you who have time and willingness to stay a little while. We can continue a discussion afterwards. So this lecture will have four main parts. First, I will talk about the sword as a weapon, of course, but also as an attribute and symbol, because the sword is never only a sword, only a weapon. It's always a lot of other things involved in the sword. Then we will look at some of the nitty-gritty details of what makes a sword from a functional perspective. And of course, we will only very lightly touch on this, but we'll talk about things like balance and dynamic properties. Then a major part of this talk will be about the patterns of thought, or the world of thought that the sword, most of all, the medieval European sword belongs to. This will be an overview of this. And I will end this lecture with a presentation of some of my own work. And this is something that has evolved from starting out with more careful reconstructions into more of an exploration of the sword as a timeless object, not only as a weapon, but also as an object of art. So, what do I mean with weapon, attribute, symbol? Well, there is a quote by Cassiodorus, who was secretary to Theodoric the Great. He wrote a letter of thanks to the king of the Varni, who had sent a diplomatic gift to Theodoric the Great. And part of this gift, it was a rich gift of luxury item, but part of it was swords. And he details these swords in this letter of thanks. Your fraternity has chosen for us swords capable even of cutting through armor, which I prize more for their iron than for the gold upon them. So resplendent is their polished clarity that they reflect with faithful distinctness the faces of those who look upon them. Its very steely light becomes a mirror of men. And I'm tempted to believe that this is more than just a description of what the swords looks like. I think this is a description that transcends visual, physical properties. The sword is a mirror. We say that power corrupts, but most of all, power explains and reveals. When you give power to someone, they will show you who they truly are. And the sword is an object of power. The person who is gifted or who owns a sword will reveal themselves for who they are. That's why the sword is always also an object that reminds us of our utmost responsibility, not only as sword owners, but as human beings. And then he also writes, such swords by their beauty might be deemed the work of Vulcan, who is said to have perfected his craft with such art that what was formed by his hands was believed to have been wrought by power not mortal but divine. This is another aspect of the sword. It has always been a liminal sword object that borders on ideas that are eternal and even sacred. And I think that has been true for the sword in all ages. It touches on parts of our world that is not part of the physical world. And it's an important aspect of the sword and has always been. There is a mythology around the swordsman as well. This is a quote from a fencing manual describing the swordsman. Fencing makes one who can do it well into a formidable and capable man. Well proportioned and sturdy, light, fit and nimble, ready for anything, courageous and undaunted against the enemy, valiant and stout-hearted, daring manfully, bold in war, eager to win praise, honor and victory, emboldening hundreds around them with ease. He makes you marvel at his fencing skill. So add a sword to someone and you get perfection. That's sort of the basic idea. And this is, of course, the cult of the hero, and it's central to the sword, but as everything with the sword, it should be taken as a dire warning, because on the other edge of the sword we have this. The number of the pagans thus slain was 5,000, all of whom the Christians disemboweled and found much gold and silver in their entrails, while they preserved their gall for medical purposes. This is one of the Crusader chronicles. This is the stark reality of the sword. But the idea of the sort of supreme person, or the person with integrity, the thing we strive for, the thing we want to be when we are at our best, is very much part of what the sword is. The trick question is, how do we aspire for this? How do we better ourselves? Because the warning is that when we try to do our best, when we strive for what is the very best, that's when we often do the most horrendous deeds. And it's also part of what the sword is. So when we look at the sword, its shape is defined or limited by many factors. Throughout history, it changes, not linearly or in a straight evolution. It just changes over time and place. You have how much is it a civilian or a military weapon? The dominant fighting styles and types of armor it can be expected to meet. The role of violence in society. Do you have a society where the state has violence monopoly, or is it very decentralized where every man fights for himself? The role of violence in cosmology. In many mythologies, the world is created through an act of violence by the killing of a monster or a giant. And this is usually something that is also reflected in the design of the weapons of this culture. You have the scale of economy and organization of society. Again, is it centralized, decentralized? What kind of markets do you have? How do goods travel? Is it localized production, or is it decentralized? What is the level of technology and metallurgy in a society? And finally, you have the craft traditions, which are both conservative, maintaining some designs and shapes and solutions longer than you would sort of functionally explain them. It's just how things are done, because that's how my master did it, and that's how I'm going to do it. But at the other hand, also the craft is a foundation where you can experiment. So it is this double situation. When we look at the sword in various historical settings, we can see it's always very specific. For example, we have the anthropomorphic sword of the Celtic Iron Age. These are a small group of swords. There is perhaps 40, 50 of them surviving to our time. They were made over a time that spans a couple of centuries at least. They vary, all of them are individual, but they have something in common. They are the same size. They all have this sort of very simplified hilt shape that is like an X-shaped human with a sword protruding between the legs. The size is not very big. It's like 45 centimeter blade length. They are very different from the normal fighting sword of their time. But they had a role to fulfill in Celtic society. They are found from the British Isles to the Black Sea. It's really interesting to think that this sword maintained its role over many generations, maintaining its basic design and sort of functional properties. Today we don't really know what these swords were for, but of course they invite all kinds of speculation and fantasies. My favorite fantasy, if I could say, is that these are the swords of the Druids. There's something of the sacrificial use. They had the perfect length for the deadly thrust behind the collarbone. We can't know that, for example, of course. Some of them have inlays of heavenly bodies, the sun and the moon, sometimes stars. So they are markedly different from the sort of normal fighting sword of the time. We can take a step to the Roman world, and we see the Roman gladius, for example. This is a society where violence is heavily sexualized. You have the gladiators being like a pop hero of the time. When they removed the dirt from their bodies with the strigil, that oil was sold as an aphrodisiac. And the sword of the time is obviously, it's a big phallic dagger. It's a ballad dagger. They don't hide it. It's very obvious. And again, if we go a few centuries forward, we come to the Nordic Viking Age and the time preceding. We have a worldview that is zoomorphic. You have people shifting guys between animal and human. The mysticism and worldview is very closely connected to these ideas, and it's reflected again in the design of the swords. You may see that these lobed pommels, the 5 lobed pommels, the ends is really, it's the head of a bird of prey with a beak. Here the ends are actually bear heads. And we all know about the stories of the berserkers. We can't say that this is a berserker sword, but it definitely connects to the same kind of idea of the fighter taking on sort of animal powers in their fighting. That's at least what the stories, the sagas talk about. And it's interesting to see that the swords reflect the same ideas. We can move yet another few centuries forward, and we come to a Europe where Christianity is thoroughly the basis of the understanding of the world. The sword-bearing warrior is a defender of the church. Again, the sword takes up a lot of religious iconography and symbolism. It's really a tool of war for its time. But it's more than that. This is an image that illustrates the good Christian. The good Christian is a fully armed knight. And every Christian has a mortal combat against the 7 deadly sins. And in their help, they have these little doves of the 7 virtues. So of course you also need to be fully equipped to be able to keep fighting, and everything in the equipment of this knight is given an explanation, what it stands for. And it's interesting that the sword, it's explained to be verbum Dei, the word of God. The double-edged sword is the word of God, and that's what you're armed with as a good Christian. So the sword could be seen as a manifestation of the word of God from a certain perspective. So, we leave the mysticism to a side and we move into how a sword physically is a sword. Not metaphysically, but actually as an object. And as a swordsmith, to learn this, you have to study origins. This is the only way to learn what a sword is. To do it by taking photographs and measuring the sword, making notes of the details of shape and construction. And you get something that is a full tracing of the sword with measurements and cross-sections. And from this, you can construct a dynamic profile. You can make a marking of what you know of the thickness and the width. In this scale, every notch is a millimeter, and for the width, every notch is a centimeter. When you have these two curves of the actual measurements, you can construct what is a probable original shape and also like what they probably aimed for. Because every sword is a slight deviation from this. There's mistakes in the grinding, there are mistakes in the forging, there's rust, there's damage. So you can't really do the exact measurements of the original. Those are not the true measurements. You have to reconstruct what it was originally. And this is a great help to do that. Then you can mark out a point of balance, where that is. You can mark out where the hilt node and blade node is. You can mark out where the forward pivot point and the aft pivot point is. These are the nuts and bolts of the dynamic properties of a sword. If you know these things, you don't really need to know what the sword looked like. If you can make a sword with this profile, it will perform, it will handle just like the original. This is a higher level of understanding of what the sword is than just measurements. So it's very, very useful to put these together to create a kind of a library of reference points of what is the dynamic profile for various sword types. So to show you this, I will do a little bit of a live demonstration. Thank you for bringing a sword blade. I have an unmounted sword blade here, which is very good to be able to show this. So an unmounted sword blade has a point of balance that is quite far out on the blade. I talked about vibration nodes. So there is a place I can pinch it here without dampening the vibration. I hope you can see this. And there's another place where I can mark it out without dampening the vibration. So there are 2 points of no vibration. These are the vibration nodes. They are of importance because they are points of stiffness in the blade. And then you have something that you can call like pivot points. If you grasp it just hard enough so you don't drop it, this is not scientific. You have to train yourself to do this. But if you hold it just hard enough so you don't drop it and move it quickly horizontally, see there's a place where it won't pivot. So this is, or rather it pivots around it. It's an action point and a pivot point. And if I choose another, this one moves. So as you can see, every place I choose will have corresponding pivot point somehow. These are result of how the mass is distributed in the blade. So vibration has to do with stiffness, pivot point has to do with distribution of mass. Now things change when I put a pommel on this sword. This is a tool I use to quickly test different balances. We can add lumps of clay to build a really heavy pommel. Let's see, build it up. Make a big pommel. Beautiful. Now if I test the pivot point, you see it's moved very close to the point of the sword. This is unusual to see in a single-handed sword for several reasons. I can show it on a longsword, which is something you want to have in many longswords. This is a reconstruction of or a replica of a sword that is in Ljubljana. It's a fantastic longsword, very powerful. And if I hold this sword where my forward finger is, when I grasp it and I move it, you will see the point hovers still. This means that when I maneuver this sword in swordsmanship, the point will tend to hover directly at the opponent. While if I move the sword here, the pivot is halfway up the blade. So that means when I bring it around in a cut, I use the aft hand. It's much quicker. I only have to accelerate half the blade to bring it around. While in leading the sword, I have very good control over the point is. This is perfect for a long sword where you use both cutting and thrusting. While in a single-handed sword, it's used more in a circular motion. It's more of a chore to bring it around since you only have one hand. It's still short enough that you have a good control of the point, but with this one, you see the forward pivot point is further back. And then you have the nodes. So I may show it like this. We have a node of no vibration here. In this point, the blade is quite stiff. If I strike it somewhere else, it will tend to wobble. But in this point, it's very stiff. Of course, this is the same for the grip. If I hold it here and strike it, the sword will vibrate quite violently. But if I strike it at the node, the sword is very, very stiff indeed. So that means I'm not an engineer, so I'm not using the correct language here. But you can imagine, when force is transmitted to the target through the sword via my hand, and I'm grasping a point of sort of maximum stiffness, it will make for a cleaner, more powerful cut. And especially if I'm hitting the place where it won't vibrate. So the vibration nodes and the pivot points, they work together in making a flexible sword, hitting hard and sort of without giving you detrimental feedback, if you like. So this is, in short, the important points of sword dynamics. There's a lot of variation to it. You can find different sort of dynamic profiles that are typical for different types of swords. A rapier looks a little bit different than a longsword and so forth. But to understand the sword from the perspective of dynamic profile is very purposeful and useful. So, there is this idea that the sword is, we have this, we say, form follows function. Everyone recognizes that saying. That is, however, a modernistic view of design. It is a saying that dates to the 20th century. A medieval artisan didn't explain what they did in form follows function. Quite often, it's the other way around. Form, and what we talk about function as what I showed you now with sword dynamics, that is only a small part of the function of the sword. Because, as I said, half of the sword exists in the world that is not physical. But that is as real for what the sword is as our physical world. The sword is a mystical, magical, religious object. And to be true to that sort of purpose, that function, it has to be made accordingly. And this will vary in different places throughout history. How you approach, how do you grasp the non-physical, the things that are not really present in reality? How do you give them physical shape? The European medieval period is perhaps one significant factor or element of it is that the understanding of the world was that everything represents something metaphysical. So like the architectural historian Nigel Hitchcock says, the search for inner meaning of things was a medieval habit. And I think that's very on target. So when you see something, you almost see it as a representative in a fable or in a story about something, a moral story perhaps, or a religious story. And everything was part of a creation. When we see a medieval representation of what the creation looks like, it's typically like this. And it's interesting that the Supreme Being, when he creates the world, doesn't use a hammer or a potter's wheel, or he's using a compass, a geometrical tool. The significant cut that divides darkness from light and land from water is made with a compass. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass about the face of the deep. So the act of creation is done with manifesting a geometric construction. God follows geometry in his work of creation. Doesn't invent geometry, he follows geometry. And lately, professor of architecture Robert Bork has studied surviving architectural parchments to try to find out what kind of geometry was used in the Gothic cathedrals. It's been a quarrel among architectural historians for more than a century, where the geometry was just used for a kind of decorative purpose in the tracing of the windows, or if it was actually fundamental to the construction of the building itself. And he has proven that, because looking for the pinpricks from the compass and the uninked scratch marks, he can reconstruct the actual geometry that underlies the Gothic cathedral, which is no small feat. And we can see some, I like to call them strategies, being repeated time and time again. There are some ways of construct, some forms of geometry, some shapes of geometry that are very common and very useful, obviously. So for example, the 8-pointed star with the following circle. You can see it's made from rotating 2 squares, and this circle is then made so that it cuts through the corners of this 8-pointed star. And what is it used for? Well, you can see how the distance here gives the thickness of these pillars, gives the thickness of this detail. So it's a kind of a spacer. It's used for setting certain dimensions. And then you can evolve this by folding up. You take this diagonal, you fold it up, and then you get a new height that is the basis for the next construction. So it's a kind of a combination between geometry and modularity. And of course, you can see the same kind of language and thinking being repeated in swords. In some cases, it's obvious, very, very obvious. This sword is a cathedral in sword shape. It is also the personal sword of the Bishop of Köln. And this is a fighting sword. It's not a glorified letter opener. This is actually still sharp enough to cut with. You have to be careful when you handle it. It's not just a ceremonial sword. It's a fighting sword that has been elevated to ceremonial status. And I documented this and made an analysis of its proportion. So it actually follows a fairly simple series of steps in laying out all the important sort of dimensions and how they relate to each other. So you have the basic circle that gives you the length of the hilt. That is repeated 4 times. So it's a 1 to 4, which is very, very common for these kind of big war swords. A 1 to 4 is more than 50% of them have that. And then you divide the diameter of the circle into 6 equal parts, and that is the blade width. You take a half diagonal and you make a arc that is tangent to that point. Where this touches the edge of the square, it divides the side of the square according to the golden section. It's a very simple way to construct the golden section. And that gives you the width of the pommel and the width of the rain guard. And then you make an octagon, and where these corners are, that's the height of the pommel. It's the division of the grip, and the side, the full height of the octagon is also the width of the guard. So you might wonder, why do you use these numbers? Well, 6, that's the working days of creation, minus the day of rest. 6 was also the number of perfection. It's the number of the star or seal of Solomon, which has 2 triangles, one pointing upwards, one pointing downwards, meaning as above, so below. You have the golden section, which can be repeated in all scales like a fractal. It has perhaps some mystical significance. I'm not too sure about that, but it's a common sort of stratagem. And then, of course, the octagon is very, very important. The number 8 is the first number after 7, of course. You have a full week, a full cycle, a completed work. The next day is number 8. That means a new beginning. So when you have a baptismal font, it's often 8-pointed. When you have a chapel for martyrs, it often has an 8-pointed floor plan, because the martyrs have a new beginning. And when you're baptized, you're given a new life in the church. So these things are not just happenstance. It's a way to program. It's almost like the software in a computer. By using numbers and geometrical shapes of specific meaning, you elevate the object to a very specific purpose. I'm so sorry. Maybe I should take this back. Let's see if I have better luck this way. So imagine the symbolical numbers and shapes as being carrier of meaning in a way that deepens and sharpens the function of the object in a metaphysical, but also sort of a very tangible way. So, in my studies of proportions, my hypothesis is that you have 3 basic strategies for the laying out of this kind of geometry. There are 3 obvious positions for the right angle. Any other construction means that you have to put more details in the geometry, and more details mean more imprecision. This is sort of inbuilt into the system. You don't have to have any extra. So I call them the number 1, number 2, number 3. So with these 3, you can easily construct different types of swords. And you will perhaps recognize the basic types where you can expect. So you have swords with slightly longer hilts. They tend to be based on a type 3 layout. Some long-hilted swords have a vesica-based design, but many of the later single-handed swords are based on this. This is almost an all-time classic, but it's especially common on the earlier swords from the 9th century to the 12th and into the 13th century. But you can see the swords with a sort of a wide, squat hilt, they tend to have this kind of basic layout. There are patterns within these patterns. If every sword had its own geometry, it wouldn't be very convincing. But we can see that some of these strategies are being used time and time and time again. I analyzed more than 200 swords using these methods, and these are the patterns that reoccur time and time again. These are just a selection. So, for example, you have the double inscribed octagons. It's a very common strategy. And in all of these cases, you get the very same, they fulfill the same sort of function. They give you like the thickness of the guard in all cases. So imagine all of these swords are different size, are different physical dimension, but when you scale them so the point touches the circumference of one circle, and the pommel another, so that you get the guard in the middle of the first big circle. when you draw these two facing inscribed octagons, it's a very, very tight precision. We're talking about often just a few tenths of a millimeter. To me, it's astounding that you have this repetition and precision. At the same time, you can have this strategy. You recognize it, the 8-pointed star with the circle. Here you have the width of the guard, 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 and in this case, it's the height of the pommel, the width of the guard. So you see, it's used time and time again, often for the same purpose. You can also do whole number. Oh no, sorry, this one first. The ad quadratum, you do inscribed and rotated squares. In this case, it's this the most inner ones. It gives you the width of the blade in all of those cases. It's a simple, quick way to construct geometry that involves a very small amount of imprecision. And then again, whole number divisions, which is more of a modular approach, is also a common feature. And then there is a further sort of wrinkle to this. There's an idea of harmony in proportion. You have Pythagoras, who was the sort of the patron of music in medieval period. And so his musical theory was what you learned when you learned how to compose music. There is geometry in the humming strings. There is music in the spacing of spheres, was what Pythagoras said. And you can imagine if you have a string on a musical instrument and you pluck it twice. That's the most simple musical harmony. It's the unison. It's 1-to-1. And it also represents geometrically or physically the square. You can do the octave, and that you do by halving the string and first plucking the full length and then plucking half the length. That is the harmony of the octave. And that is, of course, a rectangle with a proportion of 1-to-2. You can do the musical third, which is geometrically 4-to-5. Divide it in 5 parts. You pluck the full string and then the 4/5, and that's how you also visually create a musical third as a physical space. The musical fourth is 3/4. These are all pure harmonic notes. And these rectangles, they can have many uses. You can use them as the format for a painting, for a book page, for the floor plan of a room, for the outline of the facade of a building. It can frame the outline of a sculpture. It can be the top of the table. And in classical design, you often resort to these simple whole number ratios that have a musical harmony underlying their visual impact. And it's interesting to see that this is actually something that seems to have an importance also for swords. Not all, but many have hilts that follow these musical harmony proportions. So they are made with the geometry that results also in the visual pleasing harmony of the actual object. It's not just the underlying invisible geometry. The physical object itself has parts that relate in a harmonious way. And there seems to be a difference in the traditions north and south of the Alps. Just like in architecture, Italian architects, they named the architects north of the Alps Goths, Gothic architecture, because it was dark, it was occult. Much as you saw, the construction is sort of hidden. You have to know about it to see it. It's not revealed. Sometimes the important points are actually outside the building, while Italian classical and Renaissance architecture, the parts are often visible in the facade, in the building itself. And this seems to hold true also in Italian swords. These are interesting since they belong to the Alexandria group of swords. They are made in the same locality, sort of simultaneously. They were presented by the King of Cyprus as a diplomatic gift to the Sultan of Alexandria. And when you see them, it's obvious they are made for of the same idea. They follow sort of a general description. But they are slightly different. They don't have the exact same proportions. So what happens when we analyze them? Well, you have the classical 1 to 4 in two cases, and you have a 1 to 3 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So 3 to 11, which is another fairly common. Each part of, you see, the Vesica divides it in 1, 2, and then you have 3, 4. So that makes the hilt 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so there's a kind of a basic geometric layout, but what happens then? Well, the blade width seems to be a whole number division of either the full length or the basic circle somehow. Here is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the width of the blade is 1/10 of its blade length. Here the module is a third of the hilt. Then if you divide the hilt length in 4, in this case you get pretty exactly the pommel size in both of these cases. Not in this one, but from these two. With this module, you can get the guard width. So 4 to 5, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. You see how the same kind of operations are repeated with very slight variations? And then this one is again division in 4, and you get 10. So that seems to be a repeating pattern, at least in these three. Now you can go even further. You can do a tiny division into 6 parts or 5 parts, and that gives you exactly the thickness of the guard in the middle. Maybe that's coincidence, but it's interesting that the same operation in all of these swords give exactly the same solution. And then of course the overall proportions of the hilts are following a musical harmony. And it so also happens that this is a equilateral triangle with its point here. So it also conforms to the idea of the Holy Trinity. So now I've reached the point where I can talk a little bit about my own work. If you like, we can end the lecture here, or we can go on and I will show you how I apply these ideas in more timeless work, when I'm not working to reconstruct a specific historic sword or a historical style, but you can use these ideas and be free in the working of them. So this is what my work looks like since these past few years. I like working with geometry, not because I want to mimic the idea of a medieval craftsman, but rather because it's a way to have these, let's say, metaphysical philosophies of the sword and try to manifest them in a physical way, to try to give shape to things that are non-physical. It's approaching ideas of perfection in the physical world. So this curve here is actually the curvature of the edge. If you compress this to half the width of the blade and you stretch this out to the full length of the blade, this curve here describes the outline of the blade. And the same here. So when I construct the edge, I can use a similar sort of ratio of proportions as I'm using for the sword itself. And these ideas were part of an exhibition I did in 2020. It was an exhibition. I worked 3 years making 8 swords and 3 daggers, and they were all made on the theme of ancient Greek goddesses. So every sword was a dedication to a goddess, and sort of the principle of the goddess being like the the human condition, but elevated. And one of these swords was dedicated to Athena, and I was very honored to find it becoming part of the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum. And this is it's a breakthrough of kinds, because it means that we current contemporary swordsmiths, we can strive to make work that can be put side to side with ancient work. And we can aspire to making something that is more than just form follows function. If we consider this, it can take us to places. So I'd like to show you the process of making the Athena. Now I'm sorry to say that this face here might actually be of Apollo. So Athena is a god of war, but she is the strategist. She is the defender of cities. She is the one who goes to war to defend civilization. Ares, the other Greek god of war, he was not good friends with Athena. He actually feared her. He had the ferociousness, the bloodthirst of the battlefield. But Athena had the clarity, the strategy, and science. And I find Athena to be a fascinating mythological figure. I also wanted to explore this idea that the sword is anthropomorphic by nature. We saw this already in those Celtic swords, but there is always something human in the shape of the sword. You have the width of the guard, it's like the width of the shoulders, you have the head, you have the upper body, you have... So I wanted to explore that theme. And there is a long process of sketching involved with the making of all of these swords. You can see how the human figure is more or less obvious in all of them once you're invited to that thought. But with the case of Athena, I felt I needed to move away from the obvious anthropomorphic hints, and instead, for a time I explored this idea of Athena bursting out of the head of Zeus, fully formed, fully armored. So I thought about, you know, the aching head of Zeus being split open by a golden sphere or something like that. But eventually and in these cases you have like the split of the head, and I would put a raw diamond in the middle of a gilded ground. But I left that idea, and I instead thought, no, you have the strategy, you have the science, you have logic, you have geometry. That's the sword of Athena should be the most obviously geometrical of all of them. So I thought, no, the decoration and the design should be even more sort of pulled back and sort of severe. So I did a layout using a type 3 layout with the hilt being defined by the first circle, and this is 2 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, 2 to 9. It just so happens that it's the shoulder width to body height of many Athena sculptures. But that's aside. And then the sword rests like this. Now we can take a look at the design of the hilt. So you do a division of 4, and that 1/4 is the blade width. You divide it in 3, and that gives you the diameter of the pommel. It is also the width of the guard. And that construction is the foundation for the shape and proportion of the hilt. Then, of course, since there's architecture involved, and I thought I should look at the Greek temple. And there is one element of the Greek temple where most shapes have a curve to them. The Greek talked about entasis, a pillar that lifts a roof, or should look like a muscle working. So there is a swelling to the shape. There is also a compensation for straight horizontal lines. They should have a slight bend to them, otherwise they may feel like they're drooping and become sort of weak. So there was a lot of these very, very subtle curvatures going on in Greek architecture. And we have several examples of exactly how this was achieved. There is the Apollo temple in Didyma has scratching on the wall that shows exactly how they constructed the pillars for that time. So they made a drawing of the fundament of the pillar in full scale as a line drawing. And then they made the same number of divisions as the complete pillar should have, but with just like an inch thickness. And then you have the middle of the pillar, the top width and the base width as perpendicular lines. You construct a horizontal line that is about 2.5 of the radius, actually a little bit more. Closer, I think, to 2.7, I'm not sure, but it's around 2.5. And this will help you to make a section of a circle. And now, the artisan who is to make this piece of the pillar can go to the 1, 2, 3 from the top, and he can put the compass here and measure the bottom and there and measure the top, and he gets the exact measurement of the top radius and the bottom radius. And as long as he has a true middle from that stone, he can get a precision that is true to the point of his compass. So when you stretch it out, this line becomes the curvature of the pillar. It's very simple and very ingenious. This is how a true master artisan works, finding a clever, simple way to control work. We talk about them using crude and primitive tools. They weren't crude and primitive tools. They were precise tools that enables a clear-sighted mind to work precisely. So I wanted to use this, of course, in my sword. So I made my basic circle and the square. You know, they are like the brother and sister, or man and wife, if you like. So, for example, the square has a known entity on the surface. It's a 1. But when you go diagonally, it's always an irrational number, √2. So the square has its irrationality hidden inside. The circle has its known entity, the radius or diameter, on the inside. That's a known number. But the circumference is always related to pi, which is irrational. So the circle has its irrationality on the surface. And I just love that opposite between the circle and the square. You can very easily construct an inscribed square in this circle. You draw diagonal lines, and where they cross the circle, that's where you get the points of the square. If you do this and find the middle of the side and the middle of the circle, you can draw an arc that crosses exactly here. And this line is interesting because it's the height of a square that is exactly the same dimension as the inscribed square. So by doing this arc, you're actually drawing this square, but in a different way, in a different place. So you have, this one is placed in the middle of the square, this one is placed in the corner of the square, but it's the same shape, it's the same proportion. Now you have some significant points that you can use. And between these points, you can construct a curve. And when you compress this side so it's half the blade width, and you stretch this side so it's the full blade length, you get the outline of the blade. And if you're a bladesmith, you're used to sighting down the blade like this as you're working with it, to see it foreshortened. What you really do is you do this thing, but physically. You shorten the blade so the length of it becomes the same as the width or near about, and that allows you to see any irregularities or any strangeness going on in the edge. So it feels perhaps a little bit roundabout and complex, but once you see how similar this is to your hands-on everyday work, it's very straightforward. And now I'll just quickly go through what it looks like making this sword. Forging. Forging is the minor part of it. If you forge for a week, you have work for months. And I was quite happy with the pattern having quite a textile look to it. And textile had to be part of it. You know the myth of Athena and the young lady Arachne, I'm supposed to know. So textile had to be part of it. And these constructions are always based on the width of the scabbard. So you see how this diagonal is folded down, that gives the next line, equilateral triangle, that gives the next line, and so forth. So the whole scabbard the decoration is constructed with these geometrical structures. And I quite liked it, the way it looked, but it was a bit too fragile, so I added gesso on top. It's also a hint for architecture. It's almost like a whitewashed wall. Casting silver components, and now it's all of a sudden done. I've layered on shellac with leather color, and then I've added leaf gold in various layers. So it's like, I think, a dozen layers of shellac, and you can add leaf gold in different levels of this to get different degrees of goldenness. And then I made transverse lines across the scabbard, divisions according to the golden section. And these lines are also positioned in length and height according to divisions of the golden section of the parts. The pommel is forged and then textured with hammering. And here you can see I made like a wooden dock with, here's where I can construct the geometry of the arcs. It's again a geometric construction of the golden section. That is the decoration itself. Inlay and overlay of silver and gold. Carving the hilt components in wax and then casting them in jeweler's sand bolts like this. Here's the guard. That's the grip, and I covered them so I can work with the file and do the final shaping of the ferrules. That's after filing, and then everything is textured and patinated. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Athena. And with this, I thank you for your attention. Thank you.